The glass of wrecked calf on my desk was the first thing to tell me the world was ending. It wasn't a violent shake, not the kind of tremor that usually rattles the fillings of everyone living in the mid-hive. It was a ripple, a perfect concentric circle, shivering across the surface of the black, oily liquid. I stared at it for a long time, mesmerized by the geometry of it. In Sector 47, we are taught that geometry is the language of the Emperor's stability. If the angles are true, the hive stands. If the lines are straight, we are safe. But the water was trembling, and the rhythm was wrong. It didn't match the thrum of the ventilation fans or the distant rhythmic pounding of the macro forges sectors below. This was something deeper. It was a vibration coming up through the soles of my boots, bypassing the flesh and vibrating directly against the bone. I remember touching the cold metal of the desk, my fingers seeking the pulse of the city. It felt like the station was holding its breath, waiting for an exhalation that would never come. I was Kalen, a structural adept grade 4. My life was defined by the structural integrity of ferrocrete and plasteel. My office was a cramped box in the subsidence observation station, a place that smelled permanently of ozone stale sweat and the acidic tang of overheating cogitators. To you, a hive city is a home, a fortress, a mountain of humanity. To me, it is a math equation that is constantly trying to solve itself into a zero. Gravity is the enemy. Every day, gravity pulls at the billions of tons of Gothic architecture, and every day, we use hydraulics and prayer to push back. That morning, the equation had changed. I looked at the scrolling green phosphor on my screen. The readout for support, Pillar 9. A column of adamantium the width of a hab block was fluctuating. It wasn't shifting position. It was resonating. The numbers flickered, dipping into the red, and then snapping back to green over and over like a heartbeat in distress. Most people ignore the sounds of the hive. You learn to filter out the screaming of the waste recyclers and the constant dull roar of atmospheric scrubbers. But I couldn't ignore this. I adjusted the frequency of my headset, isolating the audio feed from the sensors embedded deep within the pillar's core. I expected the grinding of tectonic plates or the shifting of foundations. What I heard instead was a sound that still wakes me up in the few hours of sleep I manage to get these days. It was a groan, a long, drawn-out metallic moan. It sounded like a leviathan in pain. It wasn't the sound of metal stressing under a load. It was the sound of metal crying. I realized then that the material wasn't just bending. It was suffering fatigue on a molecular level. The city wasn't just heavy, it was tired. I stood up my chair, scraping loudly against the grate floor, a harsh sound that seemed sacrilegious in the sudden intimacy of that moment. I needed to report this. The protocol is clear. Any harmonic dissonance above a certain threshold requires immediate escalation. I grabbed the data slate, my hands shaking slightly, not from fear, not yet, but from the adrenaline of discovery. I thought I was doing my duty. I thought the system worked. I walked through the narrow corridors of the station, passing other adepts who were hunched over their own terminals, their faces bathed in the pale glow of ignorance. They didn't hear the groaning. They didn't see the water shivering. They were safe in their routine, and for a second, I envied them. I envied their blindness. Supervisor Harlan's office was at the end of the hall, slightly larger than ours, smelling of better amasec and old paper. Harlan was a man who had survived in the administrative layer of the hive by being as immovable as the pillars we monitored. He didn't look up when I entered. He was signing requisition forms, the scratch of his quill, the only sound in the room. I placed the slate on his desk, right on top of his forms. I told him about Pillar 9. I told him about the resonance frequency. I tried to keep my voice steady, clinical, the voice of a professional. I told him the structure was singing a song of collapse. He finally looked up, his eyes watery and tired, rimmed with the red irritation of dust lung. He looked at the slate, then at me, and then he pushed the slate back. He told me that the sensors were old. He said the machine spirits in the cogitators were temperamental and prone to phantom readings. He didn't check the data. He didn't ask to hear the audio recording. He just told me that the governor was preparing for the Festival of Ascension, and that shutting down a transit sector for a structural audit would cause a riot in the lower Habs. He said, "It's not shaking, Adept. You are." He dismissed me with a wave of his hand, a gesture so casual it felt like a physical blow. I stood there for a moment, realizing that the weight crushing the city wasn't just stone and steel. It was apathy. It was the sheer crushing weight of paperwork and quotas. I took the slate back. I didn't argue. You don't argue with gravity, and you don't argue with supervisors. I went back to my desk, but I didn't sit down. The vibration had changed. It was no longer a constant hum. It was pulsing now, a throb that synchronized with the blood rushing in my ears. I looked around the office. A few dust motes danced in the light of the lumen strips, agitated by the unseen energy in the air. My colleagues were still typing, still sipping their Recaf, completely unaware that they were sitting inside the mouth of a beast that was slowly closing its jaws. I felt a sudden violent urge to scream, to flip the tables, to smash the screens. But I didn't. We are trained to be composed. We are trained to trust the hierarchy. If Harlan said it was safe, it had to be safe. My math had to be wrong. I sat down and forced myself to recalibrate the sensors, typing in the override codes to dampen the sensitivity. I was erasing the warning signs with my own hands. That's when I saw the rats. We have servo automata for pest control, small cyborg constructs that skitter through the conduits hunting vermin. But these were real rats, biological filth that had survived in the crawlspaces for millennia. A grate in the corner of the room rattled the screws, vibrating loose. Then it burst open. A torrent of gray fur and pink tails poured out, flowing over the floor like a dirty stream. They weren't attacking us. They ignored the food wrappers in the bin. They ignored the warmth of the heater. They were running. They scrambled up the walls, digging their claws into the cables, desperate to get higher. They were swarming toward the ventilation shafts in the ceiling. I watched them paralyzed. Animals know. Before the logic engines process the data, before the alarms start to wail, the blood knows. The rats were abandoning the ship. They were fleeing the depths, and they were going up. In a hive city, nothing goes up unless it has to. Up is for the wealthy, for the nobles, for the sky. If the rats were trying to reach the sky, it meant the ground was already gone. I looked at the glass of water again. It had tipped over. The black liquid was spilling across the desk, dripping onto the floor, tapping out a countdown in wet, dark drops. And for the first time beneath the mechanical hum of the station, I heard it with my naked ears. A deep, grinding crack, the sound of the world breaking its spine. The silence that followed that first crack was the loudest thing I have ever heard. It wasn't peace. It was the intake of breath before the scream. I stood up my chair, falling backward this time, clattering against the metal decking. No one else moved. They were all staring at their screens, where the green lights were blinking out one by one, replaced by the void black of signal loss. Pillar 9 wasn't reporting errors anymore. Pillar 9 was gone. I looked at Harlan's office door, closed and silent. I wondered if he was still signing his forms. I wondered if he would finish his signature before the floor dropped out from under us. I didn't wait to find out. I turned to the main blast door, the only exit that led toward the transit hub, toward the possibility of ascent. "Where are you going, Kalen?" someone asked. It was Jareth, the adept, at the next desk. He looked annoyed, holding his cup of caf halfway to his mouth. He didn't feel the floor tilting. He didn't see the angle of the room shifting by a fraction of a degree. "The shift isn't over. The shift is over, Jareth," I whispered. everything is over. I didn't try to save him. I didn't shout a warning to the room. That is my sin. That is the first stain on my soul. I knew they wouldn't believe me. I knew they would argue, and in the time it took to convince them, the corridor would twist and seal us in. So I walked away. I walked out into the hallway, leaving them to their glowing screens and their ignorance. The last thing I saw before the blast door slid shut was Jareth shrugging and taking a sip of his drink, while behind him, the wall began to buckle paint, flaking off like dead skin. I ran, and behind me, the groaning of the iron turned into a roar. The transit hub was a cathedral of sweating bodies. It was the peak of the mid-shift cycle, that gray hour, where the day shift workers dragged themselves home, and the night shift laborers dragged themselves to the manufactorums. The air was thick enough to chew a soup of recycled oxygen, unwashed mechanicum robes, and the frying grease from street vendor stalls. Usually, I am just another drop in this ocean, keeping my head down, clutching my satchel against my chest to ward off pickpockets. But today I was fighting the current. I wasn't walking, I was vibrating. The image of the rats pouring out of the grate was burned onto my retinas. The sound of the groaning metal was still echoing in my skull, louder than the roar of the maglev trains. I looked at the faces around me, tired, vacant gray. They were cattle. They were cattle standing on a slaughterhouse floor that had already been triggered to drop, and they were worried about missed quotas and ration credits. I made it to the Grand Plaza of Sector 47. It's a mockery of open space, a wide ferrocrete expanse beneath a false sky, painted on the ceiling 3 kilometers up. The paint is peeling, revealing the rusted support trusses beneath the fake clouds, but people still look up and pretend it's heaven. I stopped near the central fountain, which hadn't pumped water in a decade, and that's when I saw it. It wasn't an explosion. It wasn't a dramatic collapse. It was a sound like a zipper being pulled down the spine of the world. Crack! A fissure appeared in the center of the plaza. It split the ferrocrete paving stones with jagged surgical precision, running right between a group of pilgrims and a vendor selling roasted starch rats. The crowd didn't scream, not immediately. They just stopped. The noise of the bazaar cut out as thousands of eyes fixed on the wound in the ground. It was only about a hand's width wide, but it was deep. If you looked closely, you could see it wasn't just a crack in the pavement. It went down through the sublayers. It breathed. A puff of pale yellow gas hissed out of the fissure, smelling of sulfur and ancient rot-filled air from the Underhive. It was the smell of a tomb being opened. I knew what that gas meant. It meant the pressure seals below had failed. It meant the tectonic dampeners were gone. The hive wasn't just cracking, it was exhaling its death rattle. Then the enforcers arrived. They didn't come to help. They came to silence. A squad of them clad in black carapace armor pushed through the crowd with shock mauls crackling. They didn't look at the crack with fear. They looked at it with annoyance. Dispersed, the lead officer barked, his voice amplified by the Vox grill in his helmet. Routine maintenance, sub-level conduit venting. Move along, citizens. Routine maintenance. The lie was so bold, so absurd, that for a second I almost laughed. Routine maintenance doesn't smell like brimstone. Routine maintenance doesn't make the ground hum against your boots. But the crowd, they wanted to believe it. I saw the tension leave their shoulders. They nodded to each other. Just maintenance, they muttered. Just a vent. They turned back to their shopping, back to their commute. They chose the comfortable lie over the terrifying truth. I couldn't let them. I grabbed the arm of a man next to me, a heavy-set factory foreman with grease under his fingernails. "It's not a vent," I hissed, my voice shaking. "I'm a structural adept. That's a stress fracture. The primary load-bearing strata are failing. You need to get to the upper transit spines. Now." He looked at me, then at my adept robes, which were crumpled and stained with sweat. He pulled his arm away with a sneer. If it was dangerous, the sirens would be ringing scribe. Go back to your numbers. He walked away. I tried again. I stopped a woman holding a child. Please, I said. Go up. Go as high as you can. She pulled the child closer, looking at me like I was a madman, a doomsayer from the cults. The enforcer said it's safe, she whispered, backing away. I realized then that the system is stronger than survival instinct. These people had been bred for generations to trust the voice in the speaker, to trust the uniform, to trust the schedule. They couldn't conceive of a world where the floor simply ceased to exist. I backed away, bumping into bodies that felt like sandbags waiting to fall. I looked up at the sky again. The ventilation fans were changing pitch. They were whining a high-pitched keen that most people would mistake for wind. But it wasn't wind. The fans were reversing. The pressure from below was so great, it was forcing the air back up the shafts. We were being turned into a chimney for the fire that was lighting up in the deep. I scrambled toward the comms booth on the edge of the plaza. I had to call my sister. She lived 3 sectors over near the macro canals. If I couldn't save the crowd, I could save my blood. I punched in her code, my fingers slipping on the greasy keypad. The connection chimed, then crackled with static. Kaylin, her voice was tinny distant. Where are you? You're late for dinner. Listen to me, I said, pressing the receiver so hard against my ear, it hurt. Get the kids. Get to the lifters. Don't pack. Just go. What, Kaylin, stop. The news says there's a gas leak in Sector 47. They're containing it. There is no containment, I shouted, drawing looks from passers-by. The news is a lie. The Foundation is gone, Alara. The city is falling. Please. There was a pause. You're scaring the children, she said, her voice cold. Come home. Sleep it off. We'll talk when you're rational. The line went dead. I stood there, holding the dead receiver. The disconnect tone hummed in my ear, a flat, monotone note of rejection. I was alone, surrounded by millions of people packed shoulder to shoulder, and I was completely, utterly alone. I dropped the receiver, and it swung on its cord, hitting the metal wall with a dull clunk. Clunk, clunk, clunk. It sounded like a gavel banging in a courtroom sentencing us all. I looked back at the crack in the plaza. It had grown. It was wider now, and the gas was thicker, curling around the ankles of the enforcers who stood guard. They were coughing now, their helmets filtering out the toxins, but I could see them shifting their weight. Even the dogs of the state were getting nervous, and then I saw the sign that broke me. Not the crack, not the gas, not the denial. I looked past the fake skyline toward the high-spire docking bays visible through the distant structural lattice. The private docking bays. The ones reserved for the guilders, the nobility, the high administration. Usually you see 1 or 2 ships a day. Tonight the sky was full of engine flares. They were leaving. Dozens of sleek, gilded lighters were ascending, burning hard for orbit. No flight plans filed. No announcements. Just a silent exodus of the gold and the silver, leaving the iron and the flesh behind. They knew. The governor knew. Harlan knew. They weren't fixing the leak. They were just keeping the cattle calm while they packed their bags. A laugh bubbled up in my throat, a dry, jagged thing. I wasn't an adept anymore. I was a witness. I backed into the shadows of a supply alcove, my back pressing against the cold, vibrating metal of the wall. The vibration was violent now. It rattled my teeth. The routine maintenance was about to finish. The invisible fracture was about to become the only thing in the world. I watched the ships disappear into the smog, tiny stars of betrayal. You cowards, I whispered to the uncaring ceiling. You didn't even say goodbye. And then the ground lurched. Not a shake, a drop. The entire plaza fell 1/2 meter in a single heartbeat. The screaming started. The 1/2 meter drop was the warning shot. It was the universe racking the slide of a bolt pistol before putting the muzzle against our temple. For 3 seconds, there was absolute silence in the plaza. The screaming hadn't fully wound up yet. It was just a collective intake of breath, a million people freezing as their brains tried to process why the horizon had suddenly jumped upwards. I didn't freeze. I knew the physics. A drop like that meant the primary locking clamps had sheared. We were no longer held by bolts. We were held by friction. I threw myself at a stanchion, a thick iron post used to tie down cargo haulers. I wrapped my arms and legs around it, locking my fingers together until the knuckles turned white. I didn't look at the people around me. I couldn't. I just pressed my face against the cold, rusted metal and squeezed my eyes shut. Then the screaming started a wave of noise that hit me like a physical blow. But it was drowned out almost instantly. It began with a sound that wasn't a sound. It was a pressure wave. My ears popped violently, blood trickling down my neck. And then the snap. Imagine a tree branch breaking, but the tree is made of adamantium and is 5 kilometers thick. It was a crack that bypassed the ears and went straight to the skeleton. It vibrated my teeth in their sockets. It turned my vision into a blur of gray static. Above the plaza, the fake sky tore open. The painted clouds ripped apart to reveal the jagged, sparking wounds of severed power conduits and twisting rebar. The great pillar, the spine of Sector 47, had given up. It didn't just break, it detonated under the tension. I saw a piece of plasteel the size of a cathedral tumble down from the upper strata, crushing the enforcers, who had been barking orders just moments ago. They were gone in a blink. Smear and dust. Then the stomach-turning lurch hit. You know the feeling when a fast lift starts its descent. That sudden weightlessness, where your entrails float up into your chest. Multiply that by 1,000. We weren't just descending, we were detaching. The entire sector, millions of tons of city, millions of lives, slid free from the main Hive body. The sensation was sickening. Gravity became a suggestion rather than a law. For a moment we were in free fall, and the artificial gravity generators fought against the natural acceleration. The result was chaos. People were lifted off their feet, flailing in the air like drowning swimmers. Debris floated upward. The vendor's cart, the roasted rats, the holy icons, everything suspended in a nausea-inducing equilibrium before the physics caught up. "Hold on!" I screamed, but I couldn't even hear my own voice. The air was being sucked out of the plaza, rushing upwards into the vacuum created by our descent. The wind was a hurricane, tearing clothes from bodies, ripping children from their mothers' arms. I saw the foreman I had tried to warn. He was tumbling through the air, his face twisted in a silent howl, clawing at nothing but dust. He flew past me horizontal before smashing into a support column with a wet crunch. I buried my face in the crook of my elbow. I didn't want to see who else was flying. I just held on. I became part of the iron post. I was no longer Kalen. I was just a tension knot in the metal. The lights died in a cascading failure. The sun on the ceiling flickered and went black. The street lamps exploded in showers of sparks. The only illumination came from the tearing metal itself, sparks the size of fireworks raining down as the sector scraped against the walls of the shaft it was falling through. We were sliding down the throat of the world, surrounded by a halo of grinding fire. The noise was absolute. It was the roar of a planet screaming. The friction was heating the air, turning the freezing wind into a blast furnace. I could smell burning hair, burning ozone, burning flesh. We were falling, not sliding, falling. The speed picked up. The wind became a solid wall, pressing me against the post. I felt my grip slipping. My muscles were burning, screaming for release. Let go. A voice in my head whispered, "It's easier. Just let go and fly." But I didn't. I bit my tongue until I tasted copper. I focused on the pain. Pain was real. Pain meant I was still biological matter, not just debris. I counted the seconds. 1, 2, 3. A fall this long meant we were passing the lower halves. 4, 5. We were passing the manufactorum levels. 6, 7. We were entering the dark. The sparks above grew more distant. We were plunging into the true abyss, the miles-deep void between the city and the sump. The terror wasn't the crash. The terror was the weight. We were trapped in a falling coffin the size of a city block, and we had time to think about it. I wondered if my sister had looked up. I wondered if she saw the sector fall like a discarded toy. I wondered if she felt the tremor of our death before it even happened. The darkness was absolute now. No sparks, no emergency lights, just the howling wind and the crushing sensation of velocity. I realized then that I was crying. Not sobbing, just tears being ripped from my eyes by the wind. I wasn't praying to the Emperor. I wasn't repenting. I was doing math, calculating terminal velocity, calculating impact force, calculating the percentage of survival. It was 0. It was all 0. And in the dark, I tightened my grip and I waited for the end of the world. You think falling is fast. You think it's a rush of wind, a scream, and then the dark. That's gravity in a vacuum. But we weren't in a vacuum. We were 1 trillion tons of rock and steel grinding down a shaft that was barely wide enough to contain us. The sector didn't just fall, it scraped. It screamed against the walls of the Hive shaft, shedding layers of armor and habitation blocks, like skin being flayed from bone. The velocity wasn't constant. We would drop in sickening bursts of speed, then slam into a protrusion, shuddering violently enough to liquefy your organs, then drop again. It went on for minutes. Minutes. Do you know how long a minute is when you are waiting to die? It is an era. The darkness wasn't empty, it was solid. It pressed against my eyes, heavy and suffocating. I couldn't stay on the stanchion. The friction was heating the metal. The iron post I was hugging was becoming an oven. I could smell the synthetic fabric of my adept robes beginning to singe. If I stayed there, I would cook before I crashed. I needed a shell. I needed a box. My eyes adjusted to the strobe light rhythm of the sparks raining down from above. Every flash illuminated a nightmare. Bodies floating in the updraft debris, spinning like shrapnel. Then I saw it. A maintenance bulkhead. A reinforced localized command shelter designed for foremen to survive industrial accidents. It was 10 meters away. 10 meters across a floor that was pitching and rolling like a ship in a warp storm. I let go. The wind hit me like a hammer, throwing me backward, but I scrambled on hands and knees, clawing at the rivets of the floor. I wasn't human anymore. I was a cockroach, scuttling for the cracks. I reached the handle of the bulkhead. It was cold, hydraulically sealed. I yanked the lever. The door hissed open, revealing a cramped, sterile interior lit by a single dying emergency lumen. It was red. A pulsing, rhythmic red that made the world look like it was inside a beating heart. I threw myself inside. The silence in there was shocking. The roar of the fall was muffled to a dull throb. But I wasn't alone. A hand grabbed my ankle. I looked down. A woman was crawling after me. Her face was a mask of blood and dust illuminated by the red strobe. She wasn't screaming. She didn't have the breath for it. She just looked at me. Her eyes were wide white circles in the red gloom. She reached out her finger, slipping on the metal of the threshold. "Help," she mouthed. Just one word. A simple transaction. I looked at the space inside the shelter. It was small, designed for 2, maybe 3. But the air scrubbers, the shock dampeners, would they hold for 2? I did the math. The structural integrity of the shelter degraded with every kilogram of added mass. The crash was coming. The math said one person had a 14% chance. 2 people had 0. I didn't hate her. I didn't even know her. She was just a variable that needed to be removed to balance the equation. I kicked her hand. I didn't stomp. I just shoved it away with my boot firmly, efficiently. She looked at me not with anger, but with a terrible hollow confusion, as if she couldn't understand why the universe was doing this. I pulled the lever. The heavy blast door slammed shut, severing her fingers from the rest of her, severing her eyes from mine. I spun the locking wheel. I heard a thud against the outside of the door. Once, twice, then nothing. Just the roar of the descent. You judge me. I can feel it. But you weren't falling. You weren't doing the math. I strapped myself into the acceleration chair. The harness dug into my shoulders, a cruel embrace. The red light pulsed. Thump, 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 thump. It matched my heartbeat. I closed my eyes and tried to visualize the map of the Hive. We had passed the manufactorums. We had passed the waste reclamation zones. We were in the sump territory now. The Underhive, the bottom of the barrel. The pressure in the cabin was spiking. My ears felt like they were filled with wet concrete. I started counting backward from 10. I didn't pray to the Emperor. He sits on a golden throne on Terra. He doesn't catch falling cities. I prayed to the machine spirits of the dampeners. Hold together. Hold together. The shaking stopped for a second. A moment of perfect, weightless suspension. The friction had caught on something massive, or maybe we had just run out of air to push against. It was the eye of the storm. In that second of silence, I touched the spot on my boot where I had kicked her. It felt cold. Then the universe ended. The impact didn't have a sound. It was too loud for sound. It was just an abrupt, absolute cessation of existence. My head slammed forward, the darkness took me, and I fell into a sleep deeper than the one I had sent that woman to. The first thing was the sound. It wasn't a noise from the world. It was a noise from the wiring of my own brain, a high, piercing sine wave whine that drowned out everything else. It sounded like a voxcaster stuck on a feedback loop. I tried to open my eyes, but my eyelids felt like they were glued shut with sand. I tried to inhale, and my chest hit a wall of pain so sharp it made me gag. I wasn't dead. The dead don't feel their ribs grinding against their lungs. The dead don't hear the screaming of their own damaged auditory nerves. I was alive. I was a biological anomaly in a field of terminated equations. I was still in the chair. The harness had done its job, but the violence of the stop had left its mark. My collarbone felt wrong, shifted, hot, pulsing. The red emergency light was gone. The shelter was pitch black save for a few sparks, drifting down from the ceiling like dying fireflies. The air inside was getting stale, hot, and thick. The scrubbers had failed. I fumbled for the harness release. My fingers were numb, clumsy sausages that didn't want to obey. I hit the buckle. It sprang open with a metallic snap that I felt more than heard. I slumped forward, falling out of the chair, and hit the floor. But it wasn't the floor. The wall was the floor. The shelter had tumbled. I was crawling on the control panel, my knees crunching over shattered glass dials and plastic switches. I needed to get out. The air was running out. I found the wheel of the blast door by touch. It was hot, searingly hot, as if the other side was pressing against a furnace. I wrapped my adept robes around my hands and pulled. Nothing. The frame had warped. The physics of the crash had twisted the square door into a rhombus. I braced my feet against the side of the console and pulled until my shoulders popped. I screamed, but I couldn't hear it over the ringing in my ears. Then, with a screech of tearing metal that vibrated through my palms, the seal broke. The door didn't open fully. It just cracked ajar, leaving a gap barely wide enough for a starving dog. But it was enough. The air that rushed in wasn't air. It was dust. Thick, choking concrete dust. It tasted of old stone, pulverized bones, and promethium. It coated my tongue, instantly turning my saliva into a gritty paste. I coughed a violent, hacking spasm that sprayed blood onto the metal. Dust lung, the miner's curse. I pushed myself through the gap, scraping my back, tearing my robes, forcing my body through the jagged metal teeth of the wreckage. I fell out onto something soft and uneven. I rolled over and wiped the grit from my eyes. My vision was blurry, swimming in tears and blood. But slowly, the world came into focus. I was standing. I was lying in a graveyard of geometry. The sector hadn't just landed, it had pancaked. The majestic Gothic arches, the statuary of saints, the soaring buttresses, they were all gone. Reduced to a landscape of jagged hills and valleys made of rebar and broken stone. Fires were burning everywhere, small pockets of orange flame feeding on ruptured gas lines and spilled oil. They cast long, dancing shadows that looked like grasping hands. The smoke hung low, a heavy gray blanket that hid the ceiling of the cavern we had fallen into. Or maybe there was no ceiling anymore. Maybe we were buried so deep, the rock went on forever. I tried to stand up. The ground shifted under me. It wasn't solid earth. I was standing on a mountain of debris. Beneath my boots were layers of crushed habitation blocks. I looked down. A piece of a wall jutted out from the rubble, still bearing a faded propaganda poster, "Work is prayer." The irony tasted like ash. I looked around for the others, for the woman I had locked out. There was nothing, just mountains of gray ruin. The scale of it was impossible to comprehend. It looked like a titan had stepped on a toy city. My hearing began to return in jagged spikes. The high-pitched whine faded, replaced by a dull, throbbing roar. It sounded like the ocean, but I knew it was fire and wind howling through the twisted tunnels of the wreck. Then I heard the other sounds, the wet sounds, the settling of the pile. Crack, pop, squelch. The wreckage was still moving, still compressing the meat inside it. I realized I was standing on top of a mass grave. Thousands of people. Tens of thousands. Silence would have been better. But the pile was groaning. It was digesting them. I stumbled forward, having no direction, just a primal need to move away from the heat. My boots crunched on something brittle. I didn't look down. I knew the texture of bone. I kept my eyes on the horizon, or what passed for one, a wall of twisted girders blocking the view. The air was getting hotter. I needed water. My throat was closing up. I saw a drip, a small leak from a fractured pipe overhead. I cupped my hands and caught the liquid. It was black. Oil. I let it spill through my fingers. There was no water here. There was only the fluids of machines. "Is anyone there?" I croaked. My voice was a broken rasp, barely audible. "Report." Old habits die hard. I was asking for a status report from the dead. I laughed, a short hacking sound that hurt my ribs. Structural integrity. 0. I whispered the assessment to the dark. I walked until my legs gave out, sliding down a slope of shale and glass. I landed in a small clearing, a pocket of open space sheltered by a fallen slab of roadway. That's when I saw the light. Not a fire, not a spark. A beam. A steady pale beam of light cutting through the dust fog about 200 meters away. It was sweeping back and forth, methodical searching. Rescue. Had the governor sent teams down? Had Harlan filed the paperwork for retrieval? Hope is a dangerous chemical. It flooded my system, overriding the pain. I waved my arms, though I knew they couldn't see me. I started to scramble towards it, shouting, "Over here!" Adept Kalen. Priority. 1 survivor. I stopped. The math didn't add up. The light was too low. It wasn't coming from a dropship or a rescue crawler. It was moving at ground level. And it wasn't alone. There were shadows moving with it. Hunched, jagged shadows. They weren't moving like rescue teams. They weren't checking for survivors. They were poking the ground with long poles. They were turning over debris. They were scavenging. The realization hit me colder than the void. They weren't here to save us. They were here to harvest us. The crash wasn't a tragedy to the things that live down here. It was a delivery. I lowered my arms. I stopped shouting. And I did the only thing a structural adept could do. I became part of the rubble. I lay down in the dust, covered myself with a piece of gray tarp, and I watched. And the silence stayed. The light swept over my hiding spot, missing me by inches. It was a harsh yellow beam powered by a sputtering chem battery. I pressed my cheek into the pulverized concrete, tasting the alkaline grit. Through a gap in the twisted rebar, I watched them. They weren't men. They were walking heaps of rags and repurposed industrial leather, their faces hidden behind crude, skull-faced rebreathers. They moved with a loping, predatory gait that spoke of low ceilings and uneven ground. These were the children of the sump, the bottom feeders. In the mid-hive, we called them myths, or cautionary tales to scare junior scribes. Behave, or you'll be sent down to the scavs. Looking at the serrated blades, strapped to their shins, and the heavy stub guns holstered at their hips, the myth felt very real and very hungry. They weren't alone. A few hundred meters away, near the wreckage of a luxury transit pod, a man was standing up. He was a fool. He was wearing the velvet coat of a merchant gilder, dusty but unmistakably expensive. He waved his arms, the gold rings on his fingers catching the light. Here he shouted. His voice was cracked but arrogant, the tone of a man used to ordering servants. I require extraction. My house will pay a bounty, 10,000 credits. The nearest scavenger stopped. He tilted his head, the lenses of his goggles whirring as they focused. He didn't run to help. He signaled the others with a sharp whistle. They converged on the merchant like ants, finding a dropped sweet. I watched the transaction of power flip in real time. Up there, the merchant's voice could level a city block. Down here, it couldn't even buy him a second of hesitation. One of the scavengers, a brute with hydraulic claws grafted onto his forearm, stepped forward. The merchant held out a data slate probably filled with bank codes. "Take it," he pleaded, the arrogance bleeding into panic. "It's encrypted. Just get me to the elevator." The brute didn't take the slate. He backhanded the merchant a casual swing that sent the man spinning into the mud. Then they were on him. Not killing him, not yet. Stripping him. The coat went first. Then the boots. Then the rings. They worked with the efficiency of butchers dressing a carcass. The merchant screamed, "I am a citizen of the Imperium." The brute laughed a wet, gurgling sound through his mask. "You're soft meat, citizen. And you're in our larder now." I looked down at my own chest. The brass insignia of the structural adepts was pinned there, gleaming in the darkness. Adeptus Terra, grade 4. An hour ago it was my identity. It was my shield against the bureaucracy. Now it was a target. It screamed that I was soft. It screamed that I had access to salvageable tech. I clawed at the pin, my fingers slipping on the smooth metal. The clasp was jammed. Panic flared in my chest, hot and sharp. I yanked it, tearing the fabric of my robes, ripping the badge free. I stared at it for a second. My career, my pride. And then I shoved it deep into a pile of wet sludge next to me. I rubbed the mud over the tear in my robes, smearing filth over my face, my hair, my hands. I had to become gray. I had to become trash. I began to crawl away, moving opposite to the lights. The ground here was different. We were at the edge of the crash zone, where the debris met the existing geography of the Underhive. The floor was slick, with a dark, oily slime that smelled of ancient decay. My hand splashed into a puddle, and the sound echoed like a gunshot in the quiet. I froze. A light swung toward me. I held my breath until my lungs burned. The beam lingered on the pile of rubble I was behind, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. "Don't move," I told myself. "The eye detects movement." Be a rock. Nothing, a voice grated, distorted by static. Just settling wreckage. The light moved away. I didn't exhale. I waited until the footsteps splashed further into the distance. I realized then that I wasn't shaking from the cold anymore. I was shaking from a new kind of adrenaline. The fear of gravity was gone, replaced by the fear of eyes. I was an intruder here. This wasn't my city. I was a tourist in hell, and the locals were coming to collect the entrance fee. I found a dark recess under a collapsed ventilation duct and squeezed inside. It was wet and smelled of mold, but it was hidden. From my vantage point, I could see the line of scavengers moving through the smoke, poking bodies with their spears. If the person moved, they hit them. If they didn't, they looted them. It was a harvest. I closed my eyes, listening to the wet thuds and the muffled cries. I thought about the math again. Survival probability based on stealth versus negotiation. Negotiation was 0. Stealth was marginal. I touched the empty spot on my chest where the badge used to be. I was nobody now, just another rat in the dark. And for the first time in my life, being nobody was the only thing that could save me. But then I heard a sound closer than the scavengers. Breathing. Ragged, wet breathing coming from the darkness deeper inside the ventilation duct behind me. I wasn't the only one hiding in this hole. I slowly turned my head, straining my eyes against the gloom. 2 white eyes blinked back at me. A child. A mutant, or something worse. The breathing stopped. We stared at each other in the pitch black, 2 prey animals deciding if the other was a threat. Don't a whisper came from the dark. Don't make a sound. They smell fear. I didn't answer. I just gripped a jagged shard of glass I had picked up from the floor. The war for the surface was over. The war for the shadows had just begun. Time is a difficult thing to measure when there is no sun, no shift whistle, and no clock. We measured it in heartbeats and the drying of our throats. A camp had formed in the hollowed-out carcass of a downed transport hauler. Camp is a generous word. It was a cluster of shivering, traumatized meat huddled around a thermal vent that spewed heat, but no light. There were maybe 30 of us. Mid-hivers, laborers, a few scribes. The useful and the useless, all leveled by the same catastrophe. But the democracy of the fall was ending, and the dictatorship of biology was taking over. The thirst wasn't just a sensation, it was a madness. It made your tongue feel like a strip of dried leather in your mouth. It made you look at the person next to you and wonder how much liquid was in their veins. The only source of fluid was a rupture in a nearby coolant pipe. It leaked a thick, iridescent sludge that smelled of chemical lemons and rot. I watched a man, a strong loader with arms as thick as my thighs, cup his hands and drink from it. He was desperate. 10 minutes later, he was convulsing on the floor, foaming at the mouth as the toxins shut down his nervous system. He died vibrating. The others watched him, their eyes terrified, but envious. They were envious because at least he wasn't thirsty anymore. That was the moment the equation clarified in my mind. The raw materials were there. The need was there. The only thing missing was the process. I didn't step forward to save them. I stepped forward because the inefficiency bothered me. I am a structural adept. I fix broken systems. I scavenged a canister of activated carbon from a smashed air scrubber and layers of fibrous insulation from the hauler's walls. I found a length of piping and a plastic crate. I sat in the corner, my hands working automatically, stripping wires, packing the carbon, sealing the joints with mud and tar. It wasn't a miracle of technology. It was a crude, ugly gravity filter. But when I poured the toxic sludge into the top, what dripped out of the bottom wasn't iridescent slime. It was gray, cloudy water. I took the first sip. It tasted like licking a battery. The metallic tang was overwhelming, and it carried the ghost flavor of the rot it had passed through. But it was water. It was life. I looked up, wiping my mouth, and saw 20 pairs of eyes locked on the plastic crate. They weren't looking at me as a man. They were looking at me as a god, or perhaps as a faucet. The dynamic of the room shifted instantly. I wasn't the weak scribe hiding in the corner anymore. I held the lever. "Line up," I rasped. My voice sounded like grinding stones. 1 cup. No more. They obeyed. The hierarchy reasserted itself, not based on rank or wealth, but on hydration. I became the judge. A mother with a crying infant came forward. I gave her a cup and a half. An injured elderly man, his leg crushed and gangrenous, crawled towards me. I looked at him. I looked at the limited supply of carbon in the filter. Every liter of water I pushed through degraded the medium. There was a finite amount of life in that machine. The math was cold, but it was undeniable. The old man was a structural failure. Pouring resources into him was a waste of material. "No," I said. He stared at me, his hand shaking, holding out his empty tin. "Please," he whispered. "I'm burning. The filter is degrading," I told him, my voice flat. "It's reserved for the viable." I didn't blink. I didn't look away. I poured the next cup for a young manufacturing worker who could still walk, who could still fight. The old man slumped back, weeping dry, tearless sobs. The others watched. They didn't protest. They understood the logic of the Underhive faster than they admitted. We were an ecosystem now. I was the kidney filtering the poison. The old man was the waste. It wasn't cruelty. It was engineering. Later, in the quiet of the sleep cycle, I sat by the filter guarding it. The steady drip, drip, drip of the water into the catch basin was the only sound in the dark. It was a hypnotic rhythm. I found myself humming along to it, a low, tuneless drone. I used to hate the sound of leaking pipes in my office. Now, it was the most beautiful symphony I had ever heard. I looked at the shadows beyond the ring of our camp. I could see shapes moving in the distance, mutants, the twisted things that the radiation had made. They were watching us too. They were waiting for the filter to fail. They were waiting for us to become waste. I took another sip of the battery acid water. It wasn't mercy. It was just maintenance. The carbon in the filter was exhausted. The water was starting to taste like death again, and the camp was getting restless. I knew the math. Without a replacement catalysis unit, we had 3 days before the dysentery killed us all. So we went deeper. I took 2 men with me. Jonas, a young cargo hauler with broad shoulders and a narrow imagination, and Hick, a twitchy, nervous man who claimed to have worked in the sensor shrines. We followed a jagged tear in the floor that led away from the crash site, down into the fossilized layers of the city that hadn't seen light in 5,000 years. The air changed as we descended. It stopped smelling of wet rot and started smelling of ozone and dry, brittle dust. It was the smell of a tomb that had been hermetically sealed until we broke it. We found the workshop by accident. We squeezed through a collapsed bulkhead and fell into a space that made no sense. It was a cavernous hall, but the machines inside weren't the rusted, blocky hulks of the Imperium. They were sleek. They were smooth. They were silent. There was no rust here. The dust lay thick on the floor, undisturbed for eons. It felt wrong to walk on it, like walking on the skin of a sleeping god. Heck started shivering his teeth, chattering loudly in the silence. "This isn't Imperial," he whispered, sweeping his torch over a console that had no levers, only dark glass surfaces. "This is heresy. We shouldn't be here." I ignored him. I needed a coil. I needed a filter mesh. I didn't care if it was made by saints or demons as long as it fit the socket. I found a panel that looked compatible. I pulled my multi-tool and pried it open. The moment metal touched metal, the room changed. It wasn't a noise. It was a pressure. The air suddenly became heavy charged, with enough static to make the hair on my arm stand up. The dark glass surfaces of the consoles flickered, not with light, but with shadow. It looked like ink was moving under the glass. Heck dropped his torch. "They're waking up," he whimpered. "The spirits. They're angry." I told him to shut up, but then I heard it too. My comm bead, which had been dead since the crash, crackled to life. It wasn't a signal. It was a choir of whispers. Thousands of voices overlapping, speaking a language that sounded like grinding gears. Vox ghosts, the echoes of the dead caught in the machine's memory buffer. "Turn off the lights," I hissed, realization striking me like a physical blow. The machines weren't reacting to sound. They were reacting to the energy output of our torches. They were hungry. "Turn them off. They see the heat." We plunged ourselves into absolute darkness. The whispers in my ear grew louder, sounding wet and eager. "Flesh. Biomass. Insert." The words weren't coming from the speakers. They were vibrating directly into the bones of my skull. I felt a cold wind pass right through me, a chill that had nothing to do with temperature. It was the warp bleed, the psychic residue of a machine that had developed a soul, and that soul was insane. "We leave," I said into the dark. "Now. Back the way we came. Keep your hands to the wall." We shuffled backward, blind and terrified. I could hear Jonas breathing heavy, panicked breaths behind me. "Boss," he whispered. Something touched my face. "Keep moving," ordered, not daring to stop. It felt like wire. Cold wire. "Don't stop, Jonas." We scrambled through the bulkhead back into the wet, rotting safety of the tunnel. We didn't stop running until my lungs burned and the static taste faded from my mouth. I collapsed against a wall, gasping, fumbling to turn my torch back on. The beam cut through the gloom. Heck was there, curled into a ball, weeping. I looked for Jonas. "Jonas," I called out. The tunnel was empty. Then I looked down. Lying in the middle of the floor, right where he should have been standing, was his environment suit. It wasn't torn. It wasn't covered in blood. It was zipped up the boots, laced the helmet locked. It was just empty. It lay flat on the ground like a deflated balloon. There were no bones inside, no flesh, just the damp smell of ozone lingering around the collar. The machine hadn't taken him. It had processed him. It had subtracted the variable of a human being from the equation of the suit. I stared at the empty helmet, the glass visor reflecting my own terrified face. I didn't ask what happened. I didn't want to know the variables of that formula. I picked up the coil I had stolen the price of a man's life, and I walked back to camp. I never told the others. I just told them Jonas got lost. In the Underhive, getting lost is the same as dying, only quieter. We found the shaft by following the draft. It was a warm, stale breeze that smelled faintly of grease and ozone blowing against the cold damp of the tunnels. It led us to a vertical cavern, a throat of the hive that had somehow remained uncrushed. And there, resting on its hydraulic clamps like an altar to a forgotten god, was a cargo elevator. It was an industrial heavy lifter, a cage of thick iron mesh and scarred plasteel designed to haul ore, not people. But when I hotwired the control panel, bypassing the lockout protocols with trembling fingers, the control rune flickered to life. It wasn't the red of emergency, it was the green of operation. A collective gasp went through the group. Men and women who hadn't made a sound in days began to weep. We didn't wait for order. We rushed it. We were animals stampeding for the Ark before the floodwaters rose. We packed into the cage, pressing shoulder to shoulder, chest to back. The smell of unwashed bodies, rotting wounds, and fear was suffocating. I stood by the control panel, guarding the lever. I was the gatekeeper. As the last person, a limping woman carrying a bundle of rags, squeezed in the green light, died. It blinked once, then turned a harsh, unforgiving amber. Then red. A klaxon blared a flat, dissonant tone that echoed off the tunnel walls. Overweight. Launch inhibited. The machine had spoken. The machine has no pity. It only has tolerance limits. I looked at the readout. We were over the safety threshold by 120 kilograms. 2 people. The math was absolute. The elevator wouldn't move until the equation was balanced. Silence fell over the cage. The weeping stopped. The hope evaporated, replaced instantly by a murderous tension. Everyone looked at everyone else. We weren't a tribe of survivors anymore. We were competitors in a zero-sum game. The camaraderie of the campfire, the shared water filter, it all meant nothing against the physics of the lift. I looked at the faces nearest the door. Heck was there. He was shivering, clutching a bag of tech scrap he hoped to sell uptown. He looked at me with wide, trusting eyes. He thought we were partners. We had survived the ghost machine together. He thought that bond meant something. He was wrong. Survival doesn't have partners. It only has variables. The external sensor is jammed, I said. My voice was calm, the same professional monotone I used to use when explaining structural failures to the governor's aides. It's reading debris on the outer flange. Someone needs to step out and clear it. Just for a second. I looked directly at Heck. Heck, you have the smallest frame. Go. Clear it. I'll hold the door. He hesitated, his eyes darting from me to the dark tunnel outside. But the door, Kalen. You promise, I lied. We can't leave without you. You're the only one who knows the sensor codes. It was nonsense. Technical jargon meant to confuse a frightened mind. But he trusted the adept. He trusted the authority of the voice. He nodded, swallowed hard, and squeezed back out through the open gate. He stepped onto the rock platform. Where is it? He asked, looking around the empty floor. I don't see a sensor. It's right there, I whispered. I slammed my fist onto the close rune. The heavy iron grate crashed down with the speed of a guillotine. It locked with a metallic clang that vibrated through the soles of my boots. The red light turned green. The equation was balanced. Heck spun around his face, twisting from confusion to absolute primal horror. He threw himself at the mesh, his fingers clawing through the gaps, grabbing the front of my tunic. Kalen. No, you promised. Open it. I didn't look at his face. I couldn't look at his eyes. I looked at his fingers, dirty broken nails digging into the fabric of my stolen coat. Launch, I said to the machine. The hydraulics screamed as they engaged. The floor lurched upward. Heck didn't let go. He was being dragged up his feet, leaving the ground, his body scraping against the rough rock of the shaft wall. Kalen, he shrieked a sound that wasn't human. It was the sound of a betrayed animal. I pulled the last pistol I had taken from the dead merchant. I didn't aim for his head. That would have been a mercy. I aimed for the hand holding me. Crack. The shot was deafening in the confined space. Hicks screamed and recoiled, clutching his shattered hand. He fell. I watched him through the mesh floor, a small figure dropping back into the darkness, kneeling in the dirt, screaming my name, until the roar of the engines drowned him out. The elevator rattled upward, passing through the strata of the crushing depth. Inside the cage, no one spoke. No one looked at me. They looked at the floor, at the ceiling, at their own shaking hands. They knew what I had done. They knew that any one of them could have been Heck. But they were also silent because they were grateful. I had done the necessary sin so they could keep their hands clean. I holstered the pistol. The barrel was warm against my thigh. I felt a strange lightness in my chest. It wasn't relief, it was the absence of weight. I had shed my humanity back there in the tunnel, and without it, I was lighter. I was aerodynamic. I watched the depth gauge ticking up. We were rising toward the light. But as I stared at the green rune, I knew the truth. I wasn't rising. I was falling faster than ever. The elevator didn't stop with a chime. It stopped with a concussive thud that knocked the breath out of us, followed by the hiss of hydraulic pressure releasing. For a moment, we just stood there in the cage, blinking. We were covered in the filth of the deep-dried blood engine oil and the gray dust of dead cities. We looked like monsters, but we were smiling. The air coming through the mesh wasn't the recycled rot of the Underhive. It smelled of promethium fuel and ozone-scrubbed sterility. It smelled of the Imperium. We thought we had made it back to civilization. We thought the nightmare was over. Then the outer blast doors ground open and the light hit us. It wasn't the warm golden glow of the upper spire. It was a blinding chemical white wall of lumens. Banks of portable floodlights had been set up in a semicircle around the elevator shaft, focusing their combined candle power onto the cage. It seared my retinas. I raised a hand to shield my eyes, tears streaming down my face as the light stabbed into pupils that had dilated for total darkness. Through the glare, I saw silhouettes, not medical teams, not priests. They were blocky armored shapes standing behind waist-high barricades of sandbags and deployable plasteel shields. They were standing in perfect formation, motionless like statues made of ceramite. "Help us!" a woman screamed, rushing toward the gate as it unlatched. "We have wounded. We need water." She stumbled out onto the landing platform, her arms outstretched. She didn't get a medic. She got a warning shot. A laser bolt cracked the air inches from her feet, scorching the metal deck. She froze, her scream dying in her throat. From behind the wall of light, a voice boomed out of a voxcaster. It was amplified to a deafening volume, stripped of all humanity, flattened into pure authority. "Halt. You are entering a Zone Omega quarantine area. Do not advance. Lay down on the deck with your hands behind your heads. Compliance is mandatory." I squinted through the glare. I recognized the uniforms. Planetary Defense Force supported by Arbite's shock troops. They weren't wearing standard patrol gear. They were in full hazmat containment protocols, sealed helmets, rebreather packs, rubberized undersuits. They weren't looking at us like citizens. They were looking at us like a biological spill. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. I knew these protocols. I had read the emergency subclauses in the structural manuals. When a hive section falls, the primary concern isn't rescue, it's containment. The dust from the Underhive carries plagues, mutant strains, and the taint of the warp. To the command structure, we weren't survivors. We were carriers. "We are loyal citizens," a man shouted, holding up his ident tag. "I am a Guilder from Sector 47. Check my biometrics. You can't treat us like this." He took a step forward, driven by the arrogance of his former station. The response was immediate. The line of soldiers didn't flinch. Their weapons, heavy bolters and laser guns, were already shouldered. They weren't waiting for identification. They were waiting for a firing solution. The Vox voice boomed again, bored and repetitive. Contamination detected. Bioscans indicate Grade 4 pathogen exposure. Sector 47 has been designated a loss. There is no retrieval authorized. Return to the shaft or face summary purification. I looked at the soldiers. I looked for a hesitation, a tremble in a hand, a tilt of a helmet that suggested pity. I found none. They were just machines made of meat following a flowchart that ended in a pile of corpses. I realized then the true horror of the Hive. It wasn't the monsters in the dark. It was the order in the light. The monsters killed you because they were hungry. The Imperium killed you because it was efficient. We were a variable that threatened the stability of the remaining city. We were the infected limb, and the saw was already spinning. I stepped back, moving slowly, melting into the rear of the group. The others were still arguing, still pleading, still believing that their names and bank accounts mattered. They didn't understand. The ledger had been balanced, and we were on the wrong side of the line. I saw the officer in the center raise his hand. It was a casual gesture, almost like he was waving goodbye. But I knew what it meant. It was the command to open fire. I didn't warn them. There was no point. I looked for the ventilation grates I had spotted on the schematic diagrams years ago. I knew they had to be here. "I'm sorry," I whispered, not to the people who were about to die, but to the part of myself that used to believe in the system. The officer dropped his hand, and the light turned into fire. The first volley didn't sound like gunshots. It sounded like a jackhammer working on wet pavement. The heavy bolters opened up in a rhythmic, thumping staccato that shook the floor plates under my feet. Thump, thump, thump. With every beat, the crowd in front of me ceased to be a crowd. They became a mist. There was no screaming anymore, because the roar of the weapons consumed all oxygen and all sound. I dropped to the deck, sliding in the slick fluids that were already pooling on the metal. I didn't look at the bodies falling like cut wheat. I looked at the boots of the Arbites. They were advancing. Step. Fire. Step. Fire. It was a mechanical wall of death moving forward to scrub the stain from the floor. I wasn't a person to them. I was a contagio hazard. I scrambled backward on my hands and knees, my movements jerky and frantic like a spider trapped in a sink. The gilder who had shouted about his bank accounts was gone. In his place was a pile of shredded velvet and meat. I used him. I am not proud of it, but I used the mound of his remains as cover against the spray of las fire that sizzled over my head. The heat was intense. The air smelled of ozone and copper, a metallic tang that coated the back of my throat. I scanned the walls, my eyes stinging from the smoke. I knew this layout. I had approved the blueprints for this docking bay 10 years ago. There was a thermal exhaust port. It had to be here. "Purge teams. Advance," the Vox voice commanded. "Ignite!" Then came the sound I feared more than the bolters. The whoosh of pressurized promethium. Twin jets of liquid fire arched over the barricades, washing over the survivors who were huddled near the elevator doors. The screams returned, then high and shrill, piercing through the roar of the flames. They were burning the evidence. They weren't just killing us. They were sterilizing the site. The heat washed over me, singing my eyebrows, blistering the skin on my neck. I saw the exhaust port, a rusted grate near the floor, half hidden behind a stack of crates. It was welded shut. Standard security protocol. I crawled toward it, the heat of the flamers pressing against my back like a physical weight. I pulled the heavy stub pistol I had taken from the merchant, the same one I used to kill Heck. My hands were shaking so bad I almost dropped it. I didn't aim at the grate. I aimed at the hydraulic coupling of the steam pipe running next to it. High-pressure coolant lines. If my memory of the schematics was right, that pipe was pressurized to 60 atmospheres. Please be right, I prayed. Please let the math hold. I pulled the trigger. The gun kicked, bruising my wrist. The bullet sparked off the pipe, puncturing the seal. The explosion was instant. A jet of superheated steam blasted out with the force of a bomb, tearing the pipe bracket loose and smashing into the wall. The welded grate didn't stand a chance. It buckled and blew inward, disappearing into the dark shaft behind it. The steam cloud filled the bay, blinding the Arbites, creating a wall of white fog between me and the executioners. "Containment breach," someone shouted. Visuals lost, I didn't wait. I threw myself into the hole, diving headfirst into the scalding darkness of the ventilation shaft. I landed hard on corrugated metal, tumbling down a steep incline, scraping the skin off my elbows. I slid for what felt like miles. Behind me, the sounds of the slaughter faded. The bolters, the flamers, the screams, all muffled by the twists and turns of the ductwork. I was moving deeper into the veins of the hive, away from the light, away from the order. I stopped sliding when the duct leveled out, coming to a rest in a pile of soot and rat droppings. I lay there in the dark, listening to my own heart, hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I was alive. I was burned, bleeding, and covered in the ashes of my fellow passengers, but I was alive. I laughed then, a dry, wheezing sound that echoed in the metal tube. I wasn't a structural adept anymore. I wasn't a citizen. I was exactly what they thought I was. I was a rat in the walls. And I had just learned how to bite. I stopped running when the duct widened into a service nexus. It is a forgotten organ in the city's anatomy, a cavity where the heat from the reactors below meets the chemical runoff from the manufactorums above. It smells of warm oil sulfur and the dust of 10,000 years. This is my home now. Not a hab block, not an office with a view of a painted sky, a steel shelf in the darkness suspended over an abyss that has no bottom. I sat down my back, pressing against the vibrating metal of the wall. The vibration doesn't bother me anymore. It used to be a warning, a sign of structural failure. Now, it is a lullaby. The city is breathing, and for the first time, I am breathing in rhythm with it. I stripped off the remnants of my scorched, adept robes. The fabric was stiff with blood and soot. I let it drop into the ventilation fan spinning slowly beneath the grating. It vanished without a sound. I found a viewport a few days later. A small, dirty slat of reinforced glass overlooking the vast cavern where Sector 47 used to be. I can see the lights of the recovery teams far below tiny pinpricks of violent order, trying to sanitize the chaos. They are welding the tomb shut. They are building a new floor over the corpses of the old one. They will fail. You cannot sanitize gravity. I look up towards the distant hazy glow of the mid-hive. My sister is up there. Supervisor Harlan is up there. They are filing reports. They are drinking caf. They are worrying about their pension credits. They are the dead ones. They are walking on a crust of sugar over a volcano pretending it is solid stone. I am the only one who is alive, because I am the only one who knows we are already falling. I have a function here. I am not a savage. I am a technician of the void. I know where the pipes leak. I know where the blind spots in the cogitator networks are. I trade this knowledge with the things that live in the walls, the outcasts, the mutants, the smugglers who move between the layers. I sold the location of a pressurized steam vent yesterday for a strip of dried Grox meat and a charged power cell. It was a fair trade. The math was balanced. I don't use my name anymore. Kalen was a man who believed in the durability of things. Kalen died in the elevator when he let the gate fall. I am something else. I am the man who watches the cracks grow. I wiped the grease from my new lens, a scavenger's goggle I scavenged from the filtration intake. I looked at the wall opposite my nest. There, in the dim orange light of a heater coil, I saw it. A hairline fracture, a tiny jagged line running through the adamantium support truss. It wasn't there yesterday. It is the beginning of the next fall. A week ago, I would have screamed. I would have run to a terminal to log a Priority 1 alert. I would have tried to save them. Now I just watched it. It is beautiful in a way. The inevitability of it. The city is trying to return to the earth, and I am just a passenger on the descent. I leaned back against the warm metal. I didn't report the crack. I closed my eyes and listened to the iron groan.